"That truck is lowering property values," the HOA president said loud enough for every neighbor on the street to hear. I still remember the way a few people glanced away, pretending not to listen while listening to every word. I simply nodded, folded the notice he had handed me, and slipped it into my purse. What Douglas Whitmore didn't know was that the old Ford F-150 sitting in my driveway was worth more to me than any house in the neighborhood. It was the last thing my husband left behind. My name is Evelyn Parker. I'm 68 years old, a widow, and until that morning, I thought the hardest thing I would ever have to endure was losing the man I spent 42 years loving. I was wrong. The trouble started on a bright Tuesday morning in early spring. The sky was clear, the kind of blue that seemed almost painted, and I had just finished watering the flower beds near my front porch. The truck sat in its usual place beside the garage. The paint was faded. There was a small dent near the rear bumper. The chrome had lost its shine years ago, but every scratch carried a memory. My husband, Frank, had bought that truck nearly 20 years earlier. We had driven it across 3 states during retirement trips. We had hauled fishing gear, Christmas decorations, and once even an antique rocking chair I insisted would fit in the bed. Every time I sat behind the wheel, I could still hear his laugh. As I walked toward the mailbox, I noticed a bright yellow envelope tucked beneath the windshield wiper. At first, I assumed it was a flyer or advertisement. Then I saw the HOA logo stamped across the front. My stomach tightened. I opened it carefully. Property violation notice. Under the description section were 2 words that made me read the page twice. Ugly vehicle. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it seemed too ridiculous to be real. I had lived in Willow Creek Estates for 11 years. During that time, no one had ever complained about the truck. Suddenly, according to the Homeowners Association, it was a community problem. I stood there staring at the paper while a breeze rustled through the oak trees lining the street. Across the road, Mrs. Henderson was walking her dog. She looked at the notice in my hand and immediately looked away. That was when I realized this wasn't a mistake. People already knew. Later that afternoon, the HOA held one of its monthly meetings at the clubhouse. I almost didn't go, but something inside me said I needed to hear this for myself. The room was packed with residents. Douglas stood at the front wearing an expensive navy blazer and the confident smile of a man who enjoyed being in charge. When my turn came, I politely asked why my truck had suddenly become a violation. He leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Mrs. Parker, the vehicle is an eyesore. We're simply maintaining community standards." A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I felt every eye in the room move toward me. "That truck belonged to my husband," I said quietly. Douglas shrugged. "Sentimental value doesn't change appearances." A few scattered chuckles drifted through the room. Not many, just enough. I looked around and saw people avoiding my gaze. No one wanted to challenge the HOA president. No one wanted to become his next target. I folded the notice and placed it neatly into my purse. Then I smiled. "Thank you for clarifying," I said. Douglas seemed pleased with himself. He thought the conversation was over. He thought I would pay the fine, park the truck somewhere else, and disappear. As I walked back to my seat, I noticed something strange. For a man who loved reminding everyone about rules, Douglas looked nervous whenever anyone mentioned money. At the time, it seemed insignificant. Later, I would realize it was the first crack in a very expensive facade. The next morning I woke before sunrise, the way I often did since Frank passed away. The house was quiet except for the steady ticking of the kitchen clock. I brewed a pot of coffee and stood by the window overlooking the driveway. The truck was still there, exactly where it had been for years. The faded blue paint caught the first light of morning, and for a moment I forgot about Douglas, the meeting, and the fine folded neatly inside my purse. Then reality returned. I carried my coffee to the dining table and opened a small, wooden box where I kept old photographs. Frank smiled back at me from a picture taken beside the truck during a road trip through Colorado. We had driven more than 1,000 miles that summer. He had insisted on taking the scenic routes. I used to complain about the extra hours. Now I would have given anything for one more of those long drives. Around 9 o'clock, I headed to the grocery store. Willow Creek Estates looked peaceful on the surface. Freshly cut lawns, flower beds arranged with perfect precision, American flags fluttering from front porches. Yet something felt different after the meeting. As I passed several neighbors, I noticed the same uncomfortable expression. Some waved politely. Others avoided eye contact altogether. It reminded me of a schoolyard where everyone knew who the bully was, but nobody wanted to become the next target. At the grocery store, I ran into Donna Brooks. Donna had lived in the neighborhood almost as long as I had. She was the kind of woman who noticed everything and forgot nothing. After a few minutes of small talk, her eyes drifted toward the folded notice sticking out of my purse. "You got one too?" she asked quietly. The word "too" caught my attention immediately. I asked what she meant. Donna glanced around before lowering her voice. She told me several homeowners had recently received violations over minor issues. A garden hose left visible overnight. A basketball hoop near a garage. A mailbox painted the wrong shade of white. The fines had become more frequent over the past year. "People are afraid to challenge him," she said. "Every time someone pushes back, another notice shows up." That afternoon, her words stayed with me. I found myself thinking less about the truck and more about Douglas. Something about his behavior did not make sense. Most people who held power liked attention. Douglas seemed different. He liked control. During the meeting, I remembered the way his smile faded whenever finances came up. It was subtle, but I had seen it. Years ago, Frank owned a small accounting firm. Over the decades, I attended enough business dinners to recognize stress when I saw it. Money worries leave traces. A tight jaw, forced confidence, quick changes of subject. That evening, I attended a neighborhood barbecue hosted by a family 2 streets over. Douglas arrived wearing another expensive blazer despite the warm weather. He laughed loudly and shook hands as if he owned the entire community. Yet when someone casually mentioned rising interest rates, I saw that same flicker cross his face. It lasted only a second. Most people missed it. I did not. On my drive home, I realized something important. Douglas knew far more about the lives of the residents than they knew about his. For years, nobody had questioned that balance. As I parked in my driveway and looked at the truck resting beneath the porch light, a thought entered my mind for the first time. Maybe it was time someone started asking questions. Over the next few days, I settled into a routine that looked ordinary from the outside. Every morning, I watered my flowers, checked the mail, and waved to passing neighbors. But behind those simple habits, I had started paying closer attention to the community around me. Once I began looking, small details appeared everywhere. At the mailbox kiosk, residents spoke in lowered voices whenever Douglas's name came up. During walks around the neighborhood, I noticed unfinished projects at homes that had recently received violation notices. One family had removed a decorative bench from their front yard. Another had repainted their shutters for the second time in 6 months. It seemed everyone was trying to stay out of trouble. One afternoon, Donna stopped by carrying a lemon pie she had baked. We sat at my kitchen table while sunlight streamed through the window above the sink. The conversation wandered through familiar topics before eventually returning to the homeowners association. Donna hesitated before speaking. "You know, it was not always like this," she said. She explained that years ago the board focused on basic maintenance and community events. Residents volunteered. Neighbors helped each other. Things changed after Douglas became president. The rules grew stricter. The fines became more common. People stopped attending meetings unless absolutely necessary. Most folks just pay and move on, Donna said. They do not want the attention. After she left, I found myself thinking about attention. Douglas seemed to thrive on it in public settings. Yet there was something oddly defensive beneath his confidence. That evening I searched public records online. I was not looking for trouble. I was looking for understanding. Frank used to say that facts tell stories if you are patient enough to collect them. I remembered that advice as I sorted through property records, board meeting minutes, and community documents available to the public. Most of what I found was routine. Then I noticed something interesting. Several board meetings over the past year contained repeated discussions about budget shortfalls and collection efforts. The language was formal, but the pattern was clear. Revenue from fines had become increasingly important. The discovery did not prove anything improper, but it raised new questions. Why did a neighborhood association need so much additional revenue? The following Saturday provided another clue. A community landscaping project brought residents together near the entrance fountain. Douglas arrived late in a luxury sport utility vehicle that looked freshly detailed. He spent most of the morning giving instructions rather than helping. As people worked, I listened more than I spoke. Near noon, a contractor approached Douglas to discuss an invoice. The conversation lasted less than a minute, but I noticed the immediate tension in Douglas's expression. His smile disappeared. His shoulders stiffened. He guided the man away from the group as quickly as possible. A few moments later, the smile returned as if nothing had happened. Most people probably forgot the exchange immediately. I did not. That night, I sat on my porch watching the sun sink behind the trees. The truck rested quietly in the driveway. A soft breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass through the neighborhood. Everything looked peaceful, yet the more I observed, the more convinced I became that Douglas was working very hard to maintain an image. And in my experience, people only work that hard when they are afraid something important might fall apart. The following week brought a stretch of unusually warm weather, and with it came another notice. This time it arrived by certified mail. I sat at my kitchen table, turning the envelope over in my hands before opening it. The language inside was formal and cold. Additional penalties, additional deadlines, additional warnings. Reading it felt less like receiving a community notice and more like receiving a message from someone determined to make a point. I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the first one. Then I made lunch, watered my flowers, and continued my day. The older I got, the more I learned that reacting immediately often benefited the other person more than it benefited you. A few days later, Sarah called. My daughter lived 2 states away and checked on me regularly. I told her about the notices. There was a long pause on the line. Then she asked a simple question. Mom, why do you think he is focusing on you? I looked out the window toward the driveway. The answer seemed obvious. Most residents complied quickly. They paid fines. They apologized. They avoided conflict. I had done none of those things. Not because I wanted a fight, but because I refused to feel ashamed of something that carried so many memories. After the call ended, I returned to my research. Public records can reveal surprising stories if you spend enough time reading them. Piece by piece, I started building a clearer picture. Douglas owned an impressive home near the entrance of the neighborhood. Everyone knew it. The property appeared in holiday newsletters and community photographs. It represented success, stability, prestige. Yet several financial filings suggested a more complicated reality. The details were incomplete, but certain patterns repeated themselves. Refinancing activity, liens that had later been released, business entities connected to property transactions. None of it was illegal. None of it proved wrongdoing. Still, it painted a picture of someone managing significant financial pressure behind a polished exterior. One afternoon, Donna stopped by again. We sat on the back patio while a pair of robins hopped across the lawn. During our conversation, she casually mentioned that Douglas had recently sold an investment property. The comment caught my attention. According to neighborhood gossip, he had once owned several. Selling assets during a strong market was not unusual, but combined with everything else I had discovered, the timing felt important. That evening, I attended another homeowners association meeting. Douglas stood at the front of the room delivering updates about landscaping budgets and maintenance schedules. His voice sounded confident. His posture looked relaxed. Yet now that I knew what to look for, the cracks appeared more clearly. Whenever discussions turned toward expenses, he became impatient. Whenever questions involved finances, he redirected the conversation. At one point, a resident asked for greater transparency regarding collected fines. Douglas answered quickly and moved on before anyone could follow up. As the meeting ended, residents gathered in small groups near the exit. I remained seated for a moment, organizing papers inside my purse. That was when I overheard 2 board members talking quietly nearby. One mentioned upcoming financial reviews. The other responded with concern. The exchange lasted only seconds before they noticed me and changed subjects. On the drive home, the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. My truck rolled steadily through the quiet neighborhood. I realized I was no longer thinking about notices or penalties. I was thinking about a much larger question. Douglas had spent years watching everyone else, measuring them, judging them, controlling them through rules. But who was watching Douglas? As I pulled into my driveway, I looked toward the dark silhouette of his distant house near the neighborhood entrance. For the first time, I felt certain of something. The story he presented to the community and the reality behind closed doors were not the same story at all. Once a question settles into your mind, it becomes difficult to ignore. Over the following 2 weeks, I continued living my life as usual. I attended church on Sunday mornings. I met Donna for coffee on Wednesdays. I spent evenings reading on the porch while the neighborhood settled into silence. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, I was connecting pieces that no longer felt unrelated. One afternoon, while organizing old paperwork in my study, I came across several folders from Frank's accounting business. Seeing his notes brought back memories of the countless evenings he spent reviewing financial statements at our kitchen table. Frank believed numbers revealed character. People can hide behind words, he used to say. They cannot hide behind patterns forever. The thought stayed with me. Later that week, I arranged a meeting with Martin Hayes, an attorney who had handled some estate matters after Frank passed away. Martin was practical, patient, and careful with facts. We met for lunch at a small restaurant near downtown. I explained everything from the notices to the growing concerns about the homeowners association. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he folded his hands and asked a simple question. "What outcome are you looking for?" I considered the question carefully. I was not interested in revenge. I was not interested in public arguments. I wanted to understand why someone who claimed to protect the community seemed so determined to intimidate the people living in it. Martin nodded. Then he offered advice Frank probably would have appreciated. Focus on facts. Ignore assumptions. A few days later, another piece of the puzzle appeared. Through publicly available records, I discovered that a lender connected to one of Douglas's properties had transferred servicing rights several times in recent years. The details were technical and easy to overlook. Most people never would have noticed them. But the pattern suggested financial instability. The image Douglas projected to the neighborhood was one of complete control. The records suggested someone working constantly to stay ahead of obligations. Around the same time, conversations with residents became increasingly revealing. A retired teacher told me she had received 3 separate violation notices within 6 months. A young family described being fined over minor issues that previously would have received simple warnings. Nobody wanted to challenge the system, because doing so often created more problems. The atmosphere reminded me of a workplace where employees feared management more than they respected it. One evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, I drove through the neighborhood and passed Douglas's property near the entrance. The house was beautiful. Large windows reflected the fading light. Perfect landscaping framed the front walk. Luxury vehicles sat in the driveway. From the street, everything appeared flawless. Yet I found myself remembering something Frank once taught me while we restored an old fishing boat. Fresh paint can hide a lot of damage underneath. As I pulled back into my own driveway, I looked at the aging truck parked beside the garage. It was imperfect. The paint was worn. The bumper carried marks from years of use. Nothing about it pretended to be something it was not. In that moment, the contrast struck me. One of us lived with honest imperfections. The other seemed exhausted from maintaining appearances. And the more facts I uncovered, the more convinced I became that appearances were becoming very expensive for Douglas Whitmore to maintain. By the beginning of summer, I had stopped thinking of myself as someone reacting to circumstances. I had become an observer. Every new detail seemed to confirm what I already suspected. Douglas was working harder than ever to project confidence. The notices continued arriving to residents throughout the neighborhood. The board meetings remained tightly controlled. Questions about finances were answered with vague explanations and quick transitions. Yet beneath that polished surface, the signs of strain were becoming impossible to ignore. One morning Martin called and asked if I could stop by his office. When I arrived, he greeted me with the same calm professionalism he always carried. He slid several documents across his desk and pointed out information that had recently become public. Certain financial obligations connected to Douglas appeared to be under increasing pressure. Nothing illegal, nothing scandalous, just the kind of financial reality many people face when they overextend themselves. The difference was that most people did not spend years presenting themselves as untouchable. I reviewed the paperwork carefully. Frank had taught me long ago that understanding comes from patience, not speed. As I studied the records, a larger picture began to emerge. Douglas's position in the neighborhood depended on authority. His reputation depended on appearances. Both required constant maintenance. The more I learned, the more fragile that arrangement seemed. A week later, another homeowners association meeting filled the clubhouse. Residents occupied nearly every seat. Douglas stood at the front delivering updates with his usual confidence. He discussed landscaping improvements, compliance issues, and community standards. Several homeowners nodded politely. Others appeared exhausted. As I listened, I realized something had changed inside me. Months earlier, his words would have intimidated me. Now they simply sounded rehearsed. During the open discussion period, a resident asked about rising fine collections. Douglas responded with a carefully prepared answer and quickly moved to the next topic. A few people exchanged glances. The fear that once kept everyone silent was beginning to weaken. After the meeting ended, I stepped outside into the warm evening air. The parking lot lights had just turned on. Martin's advice echoed in my mind. Focus on facts. Ignore assumptions. That principle had guided every decision I made. It also helped me recognize an opportunity that appeared shortly afterward. Through a series of perfectly legal financial transactions involving third parties and investment interests, a pathway emerged that connected directly to one of Douglas's largest obligations. The details were complex and required professional guidance, but the possibility was real. For the first time, the balance of information no longer belonged entirely to him. He still believed he controlled the situation. He still believed I was merely a widow protecting an old truck. Meanwhile, I continued my daily routine. I watered flowers. I attended church. I met Donna for coffee. Nothing about my life appeared different from the outside. Yet every day brought another piece of understanding. Douglas had spent years measuring everyone else's weaknesses. He never imagined someone might quietly study his. One evening, I sat on the porch watching the last light fade beyond the neighborhood rooftops. The truck rested in its usual place beside the garage. Looking at it, I thought about how easily people dismiss things they do not value. Douglas saw an aging vehicle. He saw faded paint and an opportunity to exert control. He never realized that his decision to target that truck had encouraged me to start paying attention. And once I started paying attention, I discovered far more than he ever intended anyone to see. The annual community meeting arrived in late summer, and everyone knew it was the most important gathering of the year. Residents who normally skipped meetings filled the clubhouse long before the scheduled start time. Folding chairs lined the walls. Conversations drifted through the room in quiet waves. I took a seat near the middle and placed my purse on my lap. From the outside, I appeared as calm as ever. In truth, I had spent months learning more about Douglas than he could possibly imagine. He entered the room with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. Several board members followed behind him carrying folders and reports. Douglas greeted people by name, shook hands, and smiled for anyone watching. If a stranger had walked in, they would have assumed he was the model of community leadership. The meeting began with routine updates, landscaping, maintenance projects, budget summaries. Then came compliance issues. That was always his favorite subject. He spoke at length about standards, accountability, and preserving property values. The language sounded noble. The tone sounded professional. Yet after everything I had learned, I could hear something else beneath the words. Control. The room remained quiet as he continued. Then, without warning, he mentioned my truck. Not directly at first. He referred to residents who resisted community expectations. He spoke about people who believed rules should not apply to them. Several heads turned toward me. Douglas noticed and smiled. Some individuals believe sentimental attachments excuse violations, he said. A few uncomfortable laughs drifted through the room. I recognized several people from previous meetings. This time, however, something felt different. The laughter faded quickly. Nobody seemed eager to join in. Douglas either failed to notice or chose to ignore it. He continued speaking as though he still commanded the same unquestioned authority. I sat quietly and listened. Years earlier, I might have felt embarrassed, perhaps even angry. Instead, I found myself studying the room. Residents exchanged glances. Some appeared frustrated. Others looked tired. The atmosphere no longer belonged entirely to Douglas. His confidence remained intact, but the audience had changed. During the open discussion period, several homeowners asked unusually direct questions. They wanted clarification about budgets. They wanted explanations regarding rising penalties. They wanted transparency. Douglas answered each question, but his responses felt shorter than usual, less certain. The board members beside him seemed increasingly uncomfortable. By the time the meeting approached its conclusion, the polished image he worked so hard to maintain showed visible strain. Afterward, people gathered in small groups throughout the parking lot. Conversations continued beneath the glow of streetlights. Donna approached me carrying a paper cup of coffee. "Did you notice it?" she asked. I nodded. She did not need to explain. For the first time, Douglas looked less like a leader and more like a man struggling to keep control of a narrative. Across the lot, he stood speaking with several board members. Even from a distance, I could see tension in their expressions. As I drove home, I reflected on how quickly power can change. Not because someone loses a title, not because someone faces public criticism. Power changes when people stop believing appearances without asking questions. I parked beside the truck and sat quietly for a moment before going inside. The evening air was warm. Crickets chirped from nearby trees. Somewhere across the neighborhood, Douglas was probably convincing himself that the meeting had gone well. He still believed he was winning. That belief would soon become his greatest mistake. The first letter arrived on a Monday morning. I did not see it. Douglas did. Somewhere inside his beautiful house near the entrance of Willow Creek Estates, he opened an envelope that carried far more weight than any homeowners association notice he had ever mailed to someone else. I only learned about it later through information that had become available through entirely legitimate channels. The contents were straightforward. Certain obligations tied to his property required immediate attention. Deadlines were approaching. Decisions would need to be made. For most people, such correspondence would have been private and unremarkable. For Douglas, it marked the beginning of a reality he could no longer manage with confidence and appearances alone. Over the next several weeks, subtle changes appeared throughout the neighborhood. Douglas attended fewer casual gatherings. Board members began handling responsibilities he once controlled personally. Residents noticed. Nobody said much publicly, but people were paying attention. The same man who once seemed present everywhere suddenly appeared distracted. One afternoon, Donna called and asked if I had heard the latest rumor. Apparently, Douglas had canceled a planned neighborhood event due to scheduling conflicts. That explanation might have satisfied people months earlier. Now it only raised more questions. By then, the financial pathway Martin and I had discussed had continued developing exactly as expected. Every step followed proper procedures. Every document passed through the appropriate channels. Every decision was supported by legal agreements and professional oversight. There was nothing dramatic about the process. In fact, that was what made it so powerful. Real consequences rarely arrive with flashing lights and dramatic announcements. More often they arrive through paperwork, signatures, and deadlines. One evening I sat on my porch reviewing correspondence while the sun dipped below the horizon. The truck rested quietly beside the garage. Looking at it, I thought about how differently Douglas and I viewed the world. He measured value through appearances. I measured value through meaning. He spent years building an image. I spent years building a life. The distinction seemed more important than ever. A few days later, another development occurred. Additional notices connected to his financial obligations were issued through standard procedures. Nothing unusual, nothing personal. Simply the next step in a process that had been set in motion long before anyone in the neighborhood understood what was happening. What fascinated me was not the paperwork itself. It was Douglas's reaction. People who knew him described increasing frustration. Meetings became shorter. Conversations became tense. Questions that once rolled off his shoulders now seemed to irritate him. The man who had spent years demanding compliance from others was discovering how little influence personal confidence carries against contractual obligations. Then came the moment everything changed. Through circumstances created by lawful financial transfers and agreements, the ultimate holder of significant authority connected to one of Douglas's most important obligations was revealed. The discovery spread quickly among the small circle of professionals involved. Eventually, word reached Douglas himself. I was told he could hardly believe it. The widow whose old truck he had mocked. The resident he considered powerless. The woman he expected to quietly accept every notice and fine. That woman now occupied a position he never imagined possible. I did not celebrate. I did not call anyone. I did not drive past his house. Instead, I made tea and watched the evening settle across the neighborhood. For months, Douglas had assumed the story was about an aging truck. Only now was he beginning to understand that the story had never been about the truck at all. Autumn arrived quietly in Willow Creek Estates. The trees lining the streets shifted from deep green to shades of gold and amber. Cooler air settled over the neighborhood, and life continued much as it always had. Children rode bicycles after school. Neighbors decorated porches for the season. From a distance, everything appeared normal. Yet beneath that calm surface, The final chapters of Douglas's carefully constructed image were unfolding. The legal and financial processes continued exactly as they were designed to continue. Deadlines passed. Obligations remained unresolved. Notices became decisions. Decisions became consequences. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting match, and no public spectacle. The truth was far simpler. Systems that had once seemed distant and unimportant suddenly mattered very much. One afternoon, Donna called and asked if I wanted to join her for coffee. The moment I arrived, I could tell she had news. Word had spread throughout the neighborhood that Douglas would be stepping down from several responsibilities. Official explanations were offered, of course. Personal priorities, changing circumstances, a desire to focus elsewhere. But most residents understood what was happening. For years, Douglas had positioned himself as the person with all the answers. Now he seemed unable to answer questions about his own situation. Over the following weeks, changes became visible. Board meetings took on a different tone. Residents spoke more openly. Questions that once disappeared beneath procedural language were now discussed directly. People seemed lighter somehow, less cautious, less afraid of attracting unwanted attention. It reminded me of opening windows after a long winter and allowing fresh air into a room. One evening, as I returned from the grocery store, I drove past Douglas's property. I had no reason to stop, and I did not. I simply continued along the road at the posted speed limit. The house looked exactly as it always had. The landscaping remained beautiful. The exterior remained immaculate. Yet I understood something I had not understood months earlier. Appearances can be maintained long after reality begins changing underneath them. That lesson was not really about Douglas. It was about life. Frank had known it. H had taught it to me as well. Eventually, circumstances brought formal closure to the financial matters that had been developing for months. The outcome surprised many people in the community. It did not surprise me. By then, I had watched every step unfold. The process had never been driven by anger. It had never been fueled by revenge. It was simply the result of choices, obligations, and consequences meeting one another at exactly the right time. A few days later, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea as the sun began setting behind the neighborhood rooftops. The truck rested in its usual place beside the garage. The paint was still faded. The bumper still carried old marks from years of use. Nothing about it had changed. I smiled at that thought. Months earlier, one man looked at that truck and saw something ugly. I looked at the same truck and saw road trips, laughter, memories, and 42 years of love. In the end, that difference explained everything. Douglas spent years valuing appearances above substance. I spent years valuing what could not be measured from the street. As the last light faded across Willow Creek Estates, I realized the truck had never needed defending. It had already survived the test that mattered most: time. And unlike reputations built on control and appearances, the memories it carried were worth keeping forever.